William Paley's Watchmaker argument is often written off as a bad argument for God's existence, but I think that it rocks. Get it? Because there's a rock in the paper. Let's get into it. Paley begins his paper by saying, "In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had been lain there forever. Nor would it, perhaps, be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first?" Paley is referring to a universal intuition that we all share. If we were to see a rock on the ground and a watch on the ground, we would notice that there are things that are different about the rock and the watch that would make it seem that the rock could have possibly been there forever for all we know, but the watch, not so much. When we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, of a different size from what they are, or placed after any other manner or in any other order than that in which they were placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered the use that is now served by it. To reckon up a few on the plainest of these parts and their offices, all lending to one result, we see a cylindrical box containing a coiled elastic spring, which, by its endeavor to relax itself, turns round the box. We next observe a flexible chain, artificially wrought for the sake of flexure, communicating the action of the spring from the box to the fusee. We then find a series of wheels, the teeth of which catch in and apply to each other, conducting the motion from the fusee to the balance and from the balance to the pointer, and at the same time, by the size and shape of those wheels, so regulating that motion as to terminate in causing an index, by an equable and measured progression, to pass over a given space in a given time. We take notice that the wheels are made of brass, in order to keep them from rust, the springs of steel, no other metal being so elastic, that over the face of the watch there is placed a glass, a material employed in no other part of the work, but in the room of which, if there had been any other than a transparent substance, the hour could not be seen without opening the case. This mechanism being observed, it requires indeed an examination of the instrument and perhaps some previous knowledge of the subject to perceive and understand it, but being once, as we have said, observed and understood, the inference we think is inevitable that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed, at some time in some place or other, an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Now, I know William Paley speaks in King James Version, so I'm going to break some of that down to make it easier to understand. The reason we infer that the watch must have had a designer is because of these four characteristics that Paley observes within the watch. Complexity, because the watch consists of many different and connected parts. Its composition, which is the material that it's made of. Notice how I mentioned the glass that allows you to see the time, the cogs, the screws, the steel, and other metals. The arrangement or the disposition of the parts, and this refers to the placement of the material in a specified relation to the other parts. We could call this the shape of the parts. And finally, the subserviency of means to an end, which basically means the connected parts work together to meet some sort of perceived goal. He's basically saying that whenever we recognize these four characteristics within an object or something else, we infer that it was designed. Here are some things that are really important to understand about Paley's argument. He is making an inference to the best explanation. He is not claiming to have proven there is a designer of the watch. We see this from the quote in his paper, "The inference we think is inevitable that the watch must have had a maker." Therefore, it's imperative that we ask, what are the other possible options for the existence of the watch? Would we attribute it to chance, or to some kind of necessary condition of the universe? Both of these options seem absurd to us on their face, and there's a reason for that. Humans are capable of recognizing intelligence when we see it. We do this all the time. When you see a table, or a cell phone, or a book, you make an almost identical inference, that they too were designed by an intelligent mind. But why exactly do we make this inference? You might say it's because we have lots of examples of humans making cameras or cell phones or tables or books or even watches. However, I think there's something even more fundamental going on. And this is found in what I'm going to call the backdrop of consistent natural laws. Here's what I mean by that. Gravity always does the same thing. The laws of thermodynamics, electromagnetism, and the laws of conservation do as well. This allows us to observe the way the world around us operates without the activity of intelligence interfering. We know that a watch, a book, or a cell phone are not the kinds of things that would appear by the constant operation of these laws. Even if we left these laws to operate all on their own for an infinite amount of time, a watch, book, or cell phone would not form on their own. This is where the inference to design comes from. We recognize characteristics within the objects that are not produced by the regularity of the universe's laws, and then infer that something beyond that must have been the cause of the effects we're observing. But this leads us where the argument is going to get controversial for all the atheists out there. Paley says, every observation which was made in our first chapter, and what he's referring to there are the 4 characteristics of design: complexity, composition, arrangement, and subserviency to an end. Concerning the watch, may be repeated with strict propriety concerning the eye, concerning animals, concerning plants, concerning, indeed, all the organized parts of the works of nature. Atheists will typically follow the argument to this point. They're fine with saying that a watch, or a table, or a cell phone is designed. However, the moment you bring up human beings or the universe as a whole, they're not going to be happy, or they're going to disagree. But why? The exact same observations made about the watch can be made about them too. They are complex, composed of the right kind of material to be what they are. They're arranged in a way that allows the complex collection of parts to serve an intended goal of either keeping the body alive or the universe from collapsing on itself, for example. We must once again consider our options. Are these characteristics of design unique in some way to that of the watch? Is a life-permitting universe or the human body the product of chance or some necessary characteristic of the universe, while the watch isn't? I think this would be mistaken. To say that the universe or the human body are not the product of design, but the watch is, even though the same characteristics are present, would be a form of special pleading without substantive reasons for rejecting the subsequent inference. But what substantive reasons have atheists provided for trying to avoid the conclusion of a designer? Most atheists point to evolution as their escape hatch. They say that evolution, which is a process of random natural selection, is the source of all biological diversity on the Earth. This essentially amounts to saying that Paley commits the false cause fallacy, but there are 2 problems with this answer. First, it doesn't do anything to solve the problem of design in the universe as a whole, such as the cosmological constants. It only addresses the design of the human body. Second, it's question-begging. It assumes that evolution is completely random, allowing them to pick chance as their preferred solution. But what if theistic evolution is true? Atheists cannot simply assume naturalism to escape the argument. Another common objection to William Paley's Watchmaker argument is to say that it's an argument from analogy, which is fallacious. Here's an example of this from Rationality Rules.
The Watchmaker analogy is a recurring argument for a designer, which, by way of analogy, asserts that complexity requires a designer. The way Paley put it is essentially as follows. If you were walking across a field and saw a watch lying upon the ground, you wouldn't assume that it had come together by chance because it is too ordered and complicated. Rather, you would assume that it had a conscious and intelligent designer. By way of analogy, Paley then went on to argue that because life, and indeed the universe, is ordered and complicated, it too must have had a conscious and intelligent designer.
He's using the watch as an analogy or an illustration, but that does not mean that he's arguing from analogy. Those are not the same thing. Rather, what he's doing is he is recognizing these characteristics that we've observed within the watch and then saying this allows us to infer design within something, and then he's looking at the universe or the human body and saying, I see those exact same characteristics there to an even greater degree. We can safely conclude that Paley's argument is not an argument from analogy. The last objection I'll cover in this video goes something like this. We have experience with human beings making watches, but we have never observed God making a universe or God making a human body. So we have reason to infer a mind made a watch, but we can't make the same inference to a designer of the universe or the human body. But again, there are 2 problems with this objection. First, you do not need inductive or empirical support for every inference that you make. To reject this would be to reject a priori knowledge altogether, which is self-defeating because you would have to do that a priori. Second, our inference is not to a particular object. And what I mean by this, Paley is not inferring a designer of a watch because he's seen a watch designed. Rather, he's recognizing characteristics that allow us to infer design, and then we recognize those same characteristics in the universe and in human bodies. If we needed to see something designed in order to infer design, you wouldn't be able to say something is designed unless you've seen it designed, which is absurd. Take, for example, the Antikythera mechanism. This is the oldest known example of an analog computer. It would be used to predict astronomical positions and eclipses decades in advance. It could also be used to track the 4-year cycle of athletic games similar to the Olympiad. But why should we accept that this has been designed? I don't know about you, but I've never seen one of these made before. And humans have never observed an alien civilization either. However, if in the future we came to the knowledge of one, we would not say that it's not designed just because we've never observed it being made. That seems silly, because it is. William Paley's Watchmaker argument is often written off as a bad argument for God's existence, but I personally think it's time to put this back on the table and to defend it once again. Thank you so much for watching this video. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe to the channel if you're new and you want more content like this. This has been The Epitome. I'm your host, Nathan Bozeman. We'll see you around.